The monitors had gone flat. The doctors had stepped back. In the most expensive private suite at Ashcombe Memorial, Diane Whitfield, one of the most recognizable names in American finance, was on her knees beside her 9-year-old son's bed, gripping his limp hand while a rotating team of the city's finest specialists quietly admitted there was nothing further they could try. The room smelled like rubbing alcohol and surrender. And then, from the corner of the waiting alcove, just past the glass partition, a black man in his mid-40s, wearing a faded utility jacket and steel-toed boots, rose from his chair and started walking toward the door. He wasn't a physician. He wasn't a specialist. He was a janitor working the overnight shift. But in the next 10 minutes, he was about to do something none of the people in white coats had managed. If stories like this once stay with you, stick around. There's more where it came from. The hospital fundraiser had been humming along without incident for most of the evening. The atrium on the ground floor of Ashcombe Memorial had been dressed up for the occasion. Round tables draped in ivory linen, a jazz trio tucked near the fountain, servers weaving between clusters of donors in tuxedos and evening gowns who traded compliments over champagne and signed pledge cards with the unhurried confidence of people who'd never once wondered whether money solved things. Elijah Cross had clocked in at 3 that afternoon. By 8, he was pushing a cart of cleaning supplies along the service corridor that ran behind the atrium, restocking paper towels in the executive restroom, and mopping up a spill near the dessert table before anyone important noticed it. He wasn't a guest. He was the man nobody looked at twice, if they looked at all. Elijah was 44, built solid through the shoulders, but careful not to take up space, with a face that had learned, a long time ago, to stay unreadable in rooms where he didn't belong. He'd worked the overnight custodial shift at Ashcombe for going on 2 years, steady hours, decent enough pay, health coverage for his daughter. His 8-year-old, Maya, had tagged along that night because her after-school program had shut its doors early for a staff holiday, and he hadn't been able to reach anyone to watch her. She sat on an overturned supply bucket near the loading doors, sneakers swinging above the floor, working through a dot-to-dot book with a fierce concentration only a kid can bring to a noisy room she's been told to ignore. Nobody at that fundraiser would have guessed that the man wiping down banquet tables had once done work considerably more urgent than cleaning up spilled wine. 11 years as an Army Special Forces medic, 3 deployments, 2 of them to places where the wounded came in faster than the supplies did, had taught him to read a scene in half a second, to catalog what didn't belong. He came home with hands that didn't shake and a mind that kept doing triage even when he begged it to stop. He'd tried, since, to let that part of himself go dormant. After his wife Renee died 3 years back, it got easier to simply not engage. Not with medicine, not with hospitals, not with the version of himself that used to believe speaking up was worth whatever it cost. He hadn't set foot inside a hospital as anything but an employee since the morning he signed her death certificate. Diane Whitfield arrived the way she arrived everywhere. A few minutes late, immediately the center of the room. 46, dark hair swept back in a style built for authority rather than attention. Wearing a deep green gown that was expensive without trying to prove it. She'd founded Whitfield Ventures, a private equity firm known for turning around companies nobody else would touch, built on real intelligence and a flat refusal to be talked down to. She was the evening's marquee donor, having just pledged 7 figures toward the hospital's new pediatric neurology wing, an irony nobody in the room would appreciate until much later. Beside her walked Noah, her 9-year-old son, stuffed into a small navy blazer he clearly hated. He kept working a finger under the collar, and she kept gently pulling his hand back down with the reflexive patience of a mother who'd fought this exact fight more times than she could count. Noah was the fixed point in a life she'd otherwise rebuilt from the studs after her divorce 4 years earlier. He was sharp, endlessly curious, prone to asking the wrong question at the right volume, and he was, by every measure that mattered to her, the reason she still answered emails at midnight instead of falling apart. The evening moved along without trouble for close to 2 hours. Elijah had finished the restroom, cleared the spill, and parked his cart near the service door to wait out the rest of the event before hauling everything back to the utility closet. Maya had drooped sideways against a stack of folded tablecloths, half asleep. The speeches started. Diane was introduced to polite applause, said the appropriate things in the appropriate order, and returned to her seat. Noah, beside her, had reached the stage of restlessness kids hit about 90 minutes in any adult event, twisting his program into a tight paper tube, untwisting it, twisting it again, when a small crush of latecomers at the entrance caused a brief surge through the crowd, the kind that happens whenever a door gets briefly too narrow for the people trying to use it. It was nothing. No one fell. No one was even really pushed. But in the shuffle, a caterer stepping backward with a loaded tray clipped Noah's shoulder hard enough to spin him half a step into the corner of an empty chair, his side catching the metal frame. It wasn't much of an impact, the kind of thing that wouldn't earn a second glance from most parents. Noah made a face, rubbed his ribs, and looked up at his mother with the uncertain expression of a kid deciding whether this is worth making a scene about. Diane touched his arm and asked if he was all right. He said yes. She believed him. 6 minutes later, Noah's face drained of color. Not gradually, all at once like someone had turned a dial. He blinked hard, reached for the tablecloth, and then simply folded sideways out of his chair. Diane caught him before he hit the floor. His lips had already gone faintly gray, his breathing shallow and uneven enough that the two nearest tables went silent within seconds. The room changed shape instantly. Someone shouted for a doctor. Several were already moving. The crowd was, after all, full of them. Within 4 minutes, hospital staff had a gurney through the atrium doors. Within 9, Noah was on his way to the private care wing, his mother half running alongside. The first read was fast and confident. Severe allergic reaction, likely triggered by something from a dessert table. The response protocol was well-worn, and the team executed it with the unhurried speed of people who'd done it 100 times. Epinephrine, airway support, fluids running wide open. Diane was steered into the corridor and told the team how to handle it. Elijah had watched the whole thing unfold from across the room, 30 feet and a lifetime away. He hadn't moved during the initial scramble, partly because Maya had startled awake and needed calming, partly because the room was already crowded with people who supposedly knew exactly what they were doing. He watched the gurney vanish through the double doors. He watched Diane follow. He sat with Maya until she drifted back off, and then he stayed where he was because the party was effectively over and somebody still had to close down the atrium. An hour crawled past. Elijah had most of his cart repacked. Through the glass panel beside the corridor doors, he could see a sliver of the private wing. Not the room itself, but enough hallway to catch movement. A nurse passing. The steady amber light above the door marking a room in active use. He wasn't watching on purpose. He just noticed things. He always had. It was the second crash cart being wheeled in. Not a standard supply trolley, a full code cart that snagged his attention and wouldn't let go. He stood up without deciding to. He crossed to the glass. Through the narrow window, he could see the monitor bank above the boy's bed, could see the team still working the same protocol, pushing harder. More epinephrine, more aggressive fluids. He looked at the kid's skin. No EVIS, no swelling at the face or throat. Lips still faintly blue, but none of the visible markers that almost always rode along with a genuine allergic crash in a child that age. Then he looked at the rhythm strip. Even from that distance and that angle, the waveform was legible enough for eyes that had been trained to look for exactly this. The QRS complex was widening in a way that had nothing to do with histamine. He'd seen that shape before, not in a hospital. In a dust-choked aid station outside Kandahar, hunched over a 22-year-old private who'd taken a low-speed rollover during a convoy stop and whose heart had, in the space of one bad beat, decided it was finished. A rhythm disturbance triggered by an underlying electrical short in the heart's own wiring. The kind that could hide silently in a growing kid for years, showing no symptoms at all until something jarred it loose. The team in that room was treating a reaction that wasn't happening. Every dose of epinephrine was cranking a heart that needed to be calmed, not stimulated. Elijah stood at the glass a long moment. His hands were still. His face was still. Everything else was moving fast. Memory, math, the old debt he'd spent 3 years trying not to look at directly. The last time he'd been sure of something like this, he'd said nothing. Told himself he wasn't a doctor. Told himself it wasn't his place. He'd signed the paperwork 6 days later. Maya stirred behind him, small and half asleep, book sliding off her knees. He looked back at her. He thought about what it would mean to walk through that door. A janitor in a stained polo shirt telling a room full of specialists they had it backward. He thought about how that conversation usually went. Then he thought about Renee. He turned back to the glass, looked at the boy on the other side of it, and walked to the door. He pushed it open before he could argue himself out of it. The nearest nurse spun toward him immediately. The attending physician, a compact, gray-templed man in his late 50s named Dr. Andrew Bennett, looked up with the sharp, controlled irritation of a man used to being interrupted by people who had no business interrupting him. Diane, standing against the far wall, went rigid at the sight of him. "You're treating the wrong thing," Elijah said. "No introduction. No hey." The room did not respond the way rooms do in movies. Nobody froze to listen. Bennett's expression slid from surprise to annoyance inside a second, and a nurse was already moving toward the doorway to flag security. Diane stepped forward, her voice carrying the exact calibrated edge of a woman who'd spent 2 decades not letting people push past her. "We'll let you in here." Elijah didn't look at her. He looked at Bennett because Bennett was the only person in the room whose next decision mattered. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm asking you to look at his rhythm strip and tell me what you see." Security filled the doorway. Bennett lifted one hand, not toward Elijah, toward the guard, the reflexive gesture of a man buying himself 2 more seconds to think. He looked at the monitor. The tray sat there, quietly wrong, doing the thing it had been doing for the better part of an hour, while everyone in the room watched everything except it. Bennett studied it for what felt like a long time. Elijah counted 7 seconds. Then Bennett turned back with the look of a man who'd found something he wished he hadn't. "Hold the next push," he told the nurse at the 4 line. His voice was level in the deliberate way that takes effort. She hesitated. The syringe was already drawn, the protocol called for it, but Bennett's hand came up again, and she set it down. Diane came off the wall. "What is happening? Why did you stop?" Bennett didn't answer her right away. He was still looking at Elijah. "You said the wrong thing. What do you think this is?" Elijah told him. Kept it tight. The widening rhythm, the missing hives, the blow to the chest earlier that night, the way a hidden electrical pathway could sit dormant in a child for years and then misfire under exactly the right kind of jolt. He used the terminology correctly because he'd spent a decade earning it, even if nothing about the way he looked in that room suggested he had. Bennett listened without cutting in, which was its own kind of answer. When Elijah finished, Bennett turned to his team. "I want cardiology down here now, and give me an echo." Diane stepped directly into Bennett's path. "Someone is going to tell me who this man is and why he's making decisions about my son." Bennett held her eyes. "Ms. Whitfield, I need you to let us work." She didn't move at first. She looked at Elijah, the cleaning supply uniform, the total absence of any badge or credential that would explain his presence. And something in her expression shifted between fury and something she didn't have a name for yet. Then she stepped back, not because she believed him, but because the alternative was fighting in a room where her son's heart was misfiring. The cardiology fellow arrived within 90 seconds. The echo tech 4 minutes after that. Elijah stayed near the wall, out of the way, watching the monitor with the stillness of a man who'd learned that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was simply not leave. The guard had drifted back to the doorway, but hadn't gone anywhere. Nobody had invited Elijah to stay. Nobody had made him go either. The echo took 10 minutes. When the image resolved, the fellow leaned in, straightened, leaned in again, and pointed to a small irregularity tracing along the wall of the right ventricle, a congenital anomaly, the kind that could sit silent for a decade of routine checkups and never once announce itself. Under ordinary conditions, Noah might have lived his whole life without anyone finding it. Under the specific conditions of that night, a glancing blow at precisely the wrong moment in the electrical cycle, in a kid whose heart carried a hidden weak point, it had been enough to knock the whole system sideways. Bennett shifted the protocol immediately. A rhythm-stabilizing medication, careful monitoring, the epinephrine abandoned entirely. The team's energy changed too. not the confidence of people running a familiar play, but the focus of people who understood exactly what was riding on getting this one right. 7 minutes after the new plan started, Noah's heart rate began to settle. Not dramatically, not the sudden cinematic turnaround where a body decides all at once to live. It came back one increment at a time, small enough that you had to watch closely to believe it was real. But it was real. The gray tone at his lips faded by degrees. His oxygen numbers climbed back toward where they belonged. Diane stood against the far wall with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on her son's face, and hadn't spoken in almost 20 minutes. When Noah's fingers twitched, the first voluntary movement since he'd gone down, she pressed her knuckles to her mouth for a second, then lowered her hand. She didn't look at Elijah, but in the settling quiet of the room, her eyes drifted his way once before returning to her son. The story started moving before sunrise. By the time Noah had been stabilized and transferred to a monitored bed, someone in hospital administration had already opened an incident file. A staff member without medical credentials had entered an active treatment room, made clinical recommendations, and those recommendations had changed the care plan of one of the hospital's most prominent guests. Legal was looped in by midnight. A news van had a spot outside the main entrance by 6 a.m., antenna already raised. The version that traveled fastest was the one that required the least thinking. Janitor intervenes in Billionaire's son's medical emergency. The full picture was messy, but messy doesn't move as fast as clean, and the clean version had already cast Elijah as either a reckless trespasser who'd gotten lucky or something worse nobody had quite worked out yet. Elijah found out from a co-worker's text at 7:45 that morning. He was at his kitchen table with instant coffee, Maya across from him eating cereal, and he read the headline without much expression while Maya asked if she needed a jacket for school. He told her probably. He set the phone face down and finished his coffee. The hospital's review board reached him that afternoon through a formal letter, requesting his presence at an inquiry within 48 hours. Polite, no accusation outright, but the language underneath it, unauthorized presence in a restricted care area, potential scope of practice concerns, wasn't designed to make anyone feel welcome. His shift supervisor, a decent man named Ray, called him personally to say the hospital's legal office had already been in touch. Ray's tone was the tone of a man trying to figure out which side of this he was supposed to stand on. Inside the hospital, opinions split predictably. Two physicians who'd been present for the original response, neither of whom had caught the rhythm anomaly themselves, suggested Elijah's intervention had caused unnecessary confusion and that Noah's improvement was really down to the team's own adaptation. Bennett gave a different statement, plain and unembellished, laying out exactly what happened and in what order. The gap between the two accounts was its own kind of answer, but review boards moved slowly, and in the meantime the public story was being written by people who hadn't been in the room. Diane's team had a statement drafted within hours of the first news cycle. Ashka Memorial was one of 2 hospitals her firm's foundation had funded significantly, and the unspoken understanding was that the continuation of that funding wasn't entirely separate from how the hospital chose to handle the Elijah Cross situation publicly. Diane never issued it. She stayed at the hospital, spent the night in the chair beside Noah's bed, and when her communications director brought her a tablet with a drafted paragraph the next morning, she looked at it once and handed it back without a word. Noah woke up groggy and confused around mid-morning, asking for water and the TV remote. Diane kept the explanation simple. His heart needed some help. The doctors gave it. He was going to be fine, and he accepted it the way kids accept most things adults tell them with confidence. She gave him the remote, then stepped into the hallway and stood with her back against the wall for a long time, not crying because Diane Whitfield hadn't cried in front of colleagues since she was 29 and wasn't going to start now. But her hands were shaking slightly, and she noticed and made them stop. She thought about the man in the janitor's uniform, about the way he'd talked, not with the performed confidence of someone angling to be believed, but with the flat, weight-bearing certainty of someone who didn't especially care whether he was believed, who was saying it because it was true and the alternative was silence, and he'd apparently decided silence wasn't on the table anymore. She'd built an entire career on telling the difference between people who told her what she wanted to hear and people who told her the truth. This didn't sort cleanly into either bucket. She had someone quietly pull whatever was publicly findable on Elijah Cross. By early afternoon, she had a summary on her phone. 11 years Army Special Forces medic, 3 deployments, honorable discharge, a stretch working private ambulance response after he got out, then a gap, then 2 years on Ashcom's own custodial staff. A flag note from 3 years back, an internal review connected to his wife's death at a different facility. Details weren't available informally. Outcome: no wrongdoing found, case closed. She read it twice and put the phone away. She sat back down beside Noah and watched him watch cartoons with the uncomplicated absorption of a kid who had no real sense of how close it had come. And she thought about the gap in the record and the way Elijah had looked walking through that door, like a man who decided to pay a price before he knew the exact amount. She didn't know the full shape of that price. Not yet. At 11:52 that night, the monitors in Noah's room threw a cascade alarm. His oxygen saturation dropped 14 points in under a minute. His heart rate spiked, then fractured into an irregular pattern the team had already spent one night fighting. The night nurse responded inside 30 seconds. The on-call cardiologist arrived 2 minutes after that. The room filled again with the controlled urgency Elijah had watched from outside the glass 24 hours earlier. But this time was worse. The anomaly they'd found, not yet surgically closed off, wasn't staying quiet. It was progressing. The medication that had held Noah stable overnight wasn't holding anymore, and the on-call cardiologist was already on the phone with the surgical attending, running the numbers on whether Noah could tolerate a procedure at all, or whether the window to decide was closing while they debated it. Elijah wasn't in the building when the alarm fired. He was in the parking structure, sitting in his truck with the engine off. He'd come back after dropping Maya at a neighbor's, not entirely sure why, telling himself he just needed to know the kid was stable before he could sleep. He'd been sitting there 40 minutes, watching the entrance, not going in. His phone had been off since the news cycle started that morning. He had no way of knowing that 4 floors above him, the boy whose heart he'd already talked a room in his saving once was running out of time again. He turned the phone back on a little after midnight. No specific reason. He'd been sitting in that garage close to 90 minutes by then, and something had changed in the texture of the quiet around him. Not a sound, not a signal, just the particular stillness that settles in once a person has been avoiding a decision long enough that the avoidance starts to feel like the decision. The screen filled with notifications he didn't read. He stared at his contacts list for a second, then got out of the truck. The night attendant at the main entrance recognized him. Not warmly, but with the careful neutrality of someone who'd been briefed. He told her he needed to speak to Dr. Bennett. She told him Bennett wasn't on overnight rotation. He said he'd wait. She picked up a phone. He sat down near the entrance, hands on his knees, eyes on the floor. 20 minutes later, a woman came through the interior doors at something just short of a run. Diane, still in yesterday's clothes, hair loose, the composure she'd held for a full day worn down to something raw underneath. The front desk had told her Elijah Cross was sitting in the lobby, and she'd come down immediately because with her son's monitors screaming upstairs and the surgical team scrambling for a plan, Elijah Cross in the lobby was the most useful piece of information she'd gotten all night. "He's crashing again," she said. The words came out flat, not calm, past the register where panic is loud. "Worse than last night. They can't hold him." Elijah stood. "What are they doing right now?" She told him, the alarm, the fractured rhythm, the anomaly progressing faster than the surgical team had expected, the cardiologist trying to determine whether Noah could survive an intervention at all. She relayed it the way she processed everything accurately, in order without editorializing, the way she'd have briefed a crisis team at her own firm. Elijah listened without cutting in. When she finished, he said, "The echo last night. Was it a standard 4-chamber view, straight on?" "I don't know what that means." "It means the tech had him lying flat, probe angled up onto the ribs. Standard approach. Give you a good general picture. There's a modified angle, probe repositioned, patient tilted, that shows the far wall of that chamber differently. I thought the standard view was enough to work from last night. If he's deteriorating the way you're describing, there might be a second point of narrowing the first image didn't reach." Diane watched his face while he said it. She'd spent 20 years reading people across negotiating tables, and she knew the difference between a man building a story on the fly and a man reporting something he'd known for a while and was only now choosing to say. This was the second kind. Why didn't you push for it last night? Because I wasn't sure it mattered yet. And because saying it means explaining how I know, and that's a conversation I wasn't ready to have. Have it now, he told her in the hallway outside the cardiac unit. Under fluorescent lights at 10 to 1 in the morning, the muffled sound of the team working on her son leaking through the closed doors behind her. He told her about Renee, the months of vague symptoms that added up in his head to a pattern he could feel but couldn't name with the authority a doctor would need. About sitting across from a physician and saying carefully that he thought something was being missed and being told just as carefully that field medical training wasn't the same as a clinical workup. About going home and deciding the doctor was probably right, that what felt like instinct was probably just fear wearing a disguise. Renee died 6 days later of a cardiac complication that a different angle of imaging might have caught in time. The review that followed cleared him. There'd been no error to find because he hadn't been her physician, hadn't made a clinical call, hadn't done anything except fail to push when pushing felt like arrogance. The board had been thorough and fair and entirely beside the point. The question Elijah had lived with for 3 years wasn't whether he was at fault in any legal sense. It was smaller and heavier than that. He'd known something, and he'd stayed quiet, and she'd died. Diane listened without interrupting. When he finished, the hallway was very quiet. A nurse passed at the far end without glancing over. The amber light above the cardiac unit door was still lit. "You're telling me this," she said finally, "so I understand why you're sure. I'm telling you this so you understand what it cost me the last time I wasn't." She looked at him a long moment, the full look of someone setting down a set of assumptions they'd spent years building. Then she turned and pushed through the doors. Diane went straight to the attending cardiologist, a focused woman named Dr. Priya Marsh, who was running point at the central monitoring station. Diane didn't ask permission and didn't explain herself first. "There's a man in the hallway who spent 11 years as a combat medic. He believes there's a second point of narrowing your imaging missed, and he knows a modified echo angle that might find it. I need you to hear him out." Marsh looked up with the flat expression of someone running on fumes. "Ms. Whitfield, my son is dying in that room," Diane said, not loud, not a threat, just a fact she was laying next to whatever objection was forming. "If he's wrong, you've lost 4 minutes. If he's right, you've found what you're missing. I'm asking you to do that math." Marsh did the math. She waved Elijah in. He described the modified subcostal approach to the echo technician, a steady young woman named Priya's colleague, Jordan, in exact, unhurried terms. Jordan repositioned the probe and tilted the bed while Elijah guided the angle with the kind of directional certainty that comes from muscle memory rather than a textbook. He'd done this in places that made a hospital room look luxuriously equipped, and his hands didn't waver. The image resolved at 1:19 in the morning. There was a second narrowing along the far margin of the defect, invisible from the standard angle, sitting exactly where it would need to sit to be driving Noah's collapsing rhythm. Small, unremarkable to look at. Exactly the kind of thing that could kill a child quietly while a team of excellent doctors looked in the right place from the wrong side. Marsh studied it 3 seconds, then turned to the surgical resident. "Get Dr. Reyes on the phone. Tell him we have a target." The procedure was catheter-based, less invasive than open surgery, appropriate for a defect this size, carrying its own risks, but nowhere close to the risk of leaving it alone while Noah's heart kept fighting its own wiring. Dr. Marcus Reyes, the attending surgeon, arrived from home in 35 minutes and reviewed the imaging standing up. He asked 2 questions, got 2 answers, and said they were going in. Elijah wasn't in the room for any of it. He sat in the hallway on a plastic chair, in the particular stillness of a man who'd done the one thing he came to do and had nothing left to manage. Diane sat down beside him a little after 2, once the surgical team had taken Noah, and waiting was the only job left. Neither of them talked for a while. The hallway was empty in both directions. A fluorescent tube buzzed somewhere just below the range of annoying. "The review, after your wife," Diane said eventually. You were cleared. Yeah, but you left medicine anyway. I left because being cleared isn't the same as being okay, he said. Took me a long time to stop mixing those up. She turned that over. Outside a window at the end of the corridor, the city sat dark and still. I had someone pull your file yesterday, she said, without apology, because she wasn't a person who apologized for due diligence, though her voice carried the acknowledgement that he was owed the honesty of it. After what happened, I wanted to know who you were. I figured. The gap after the ambulance work. Before Ashcombe. That's Maya, he said. That's just being her dad. Diane looked down at her hands. She thought about Noah tugging at his collar at the gala, the small automatic irritation of correcting him, the 1,000 unremarkable moments that made up the texture of having him in her life. She thought about how easily that texture could have simply stopped. Not with a warning, just a boy going pale in a crowded room, and a team of very good doctors treating the wrong thing, while the right answer stood outside a pane of glass in a stained uniform shirt. I owe you something I don't know how to measure, she said. You don't owe me anything. I'm going to disagree with you on that. That's allowed, he said. But I didn't come back tonight because of what you owe me. I came back because he's 9 years old. Noah came out of the procedure at 4:08 in the morning. Dr. Reyes told Diane the second narrowing had been closed successfully. The repair looked clean, and barring complications, which he considered unlikely, her son would recover completely. Regular follow-up imaging for a few years, some restriction on contact sports for a while, and otherwise a normal life ahead of him. She thanked him. She shook his hand. She walked back into the hallway, sat down beside Elijah, and after a while said very quietly, "Thank you." 2 words, no cushioning, from a woman who'd spent most of her adult life keeping gratitude at arm's length and, for the moment, wasn't doing that anymore. Elijah nodded once. He looked tired the way people look when something they've carried a long way has finally been set down. Not lighter exactly, not yet, but different, like the body was still recalibrating to the new weight. In the weeks after, Diane didn't offer him money. She'd read him well enough to know that wasn't the point. Instead, she used Whitfield Ventures' relationship with Ashcombe Memorial and 2 affiliated hospitals to push through a new pediatric cardiac screening protocol aimed at the class of hidden electrical anomalies that had nearly killed her son, and worked with Bennett and Marsh to fold Elijah's modified imaging technique into standard diagnostic training. She did it without a press conference, the way she got most things done, quietly, without needing her name on it. Elijah found out through a short letter from the hospital's chief medical officer, acknowledging his role and confirming the review board had closed its file with no findings against him. Bennett had submitted a final statement that left no room for ambiguity about what had happened and in what order. The 2 physicians who tried to write him out of the story declined to comment further. Once Noah was well enough for visitors, he asked his mother to arrange a meeting with the man who'd helped him. Diane brought Elijah in on a Saturday morning, Maya trailing along with a drawing she'd made of the hospital, because Noah had mentioned he liked art. Noah had made something too. 2 figures, one in a white coat, one in ordinary clothes. He'd colored the one in ordinary clothes noticeably bigger. He handed it over without explanation, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a kid who assumes the meaning speaks for itself. Elijah took it home and stuck it to the refrigerator. That night, after Maya was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment and thought about Renee. Not with the old weight, the particular gravity of guilt that's been carried so long it starts to feel like part of the skeleton. He thought about her the way you think about someone you loved imperfectly, with tenderness, with the ordinary ache of missing her instead of the sharp edge of a wound. He thought about the night she died, and the night Noah almost did, and the difference between them wasn't the outcome. It was the choice he'd made the second time, the moment he'd opened his mouth. That was the whole difference. He'd walked through a door and said what he knew to be true and refused to make himself smaller about it, whatever it cost him. It hadn't required a title or a badge or anyone's permission. It had only ever required him to stop calling his own silence humility, when what it had actually always been was fear. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Outside, the city kept doing what cities do, indifferent, continuous, full of people moving through their own invisible emergencies. And somewhere across town, a 9-year-old boy with a newly repaired heart slept through the night in his own bed for the first time in 2 weeks, dreaming whatever it is kids dream when the adults around them have, against real odds, managed to get it right. Worth was never in the credentials. It's in what a person does when staying quiet would be so much easier, and the price of speaking is one only they will ever have to pay. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and stick around. There are more stories worth telling, and we're just getting started.